Now, let's look at something else. Let's go to Antiquity of the Jews. We're going to go to, thank you so much for finding King for who you are. We're going to go to Antiquity of the Jews, book 20. And we're going to go to chapter 9, section 1. Or for those of you, you may know it as Antiquity 20 and 200. Okay? And I'm going to read the heading. And it says, thanks so much, Father King. It says, concerning Albinus, under whose procuratorship James was slain, as also what edifices were built by Agrippa. So now we're going to look at an historical account of James, Jacob. Okay? And it wasn't just, it wasn't, we're going to see what particular James this was. Now look what it says here, my brothers and sisters. Starting at section 1, it says, and now Kaiser, upon hearing the death of Festus, sent Albinus unto Judea as procurator. But the king deprived Joseph of the high priesthood and bestowed the succession to that dignity on the son of Ananus, who was also himself called Ananus. Now the report goes that this eldest Ananus proved a most fortunate man, for he had 5 sons who had all performed the office of a high priest to God, and who had himself enjoyed that dignity a long time formerly, which had never happened to any other of our high priests. Listen carefully. But this younger Ananus, who, as we have told you already, took the high priesthood, was a bold man in his temper and very insolent. He was also of the sect of the Sadducees, who also, thank you for the correction, who are very rigid in judging offenders above all the rest of the Jews, as we have already observed. When therefore Ananus was of this disposition, he thought he had now a proper opportunity to exercise his authority. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of, and it has Jesus here, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. Do you see that? So now it's just not any James now, but this is James, or Jacob, the brother of Master Yahushua. Do you see that? I want you to see how we have a historical account so far of another person. We know John was connected with him, but this is explicit right here. Even if people want to try to argue and try to say, oh, well, let's just say, for the sake of argument, they'll say, well, Yehukanan wasn't connected with Master Yahushua. Well, we can see here this is not an interpolation. This is what, as far as what came down, what our ancestor had actually wrote. So we have another individual who's connected. He's the brother of Master Yahushua. We read about him where? In the New Testament. Do you see this? And it said, notice how it says that he was the brother of, and it has Jesus, but we know it's Master Yahushua. And it says, who was called Christ. So it's interesting because people may have a problem once we get to Master Yahushua, a lot of people, there's 2 quotes in Josephus about him. People have a problem and they'll say, well, these was interpolated, but this particular thing here was written. We don't see no interpolations here because he's a historian. So what Josephus is doing, he's giving you the account of not only what was known, but what was even called pertaining to the context that Master Yahushua, he was called the Messiah. You understand? So here we see the death of the brother of Master Yahushua. You understand? According to the flesh. He had a brother named James, or Jacob. So now we see here that there was a man who was the brother of the Master. You understand? Who actually lived, and we see how his death was known and recorded historically. So who are these people out here who's talking about that Master Yahushua never existed? When we have an historian who's talking about a man, well, actually this is the second witness who's connected with him. And he actually mentions Master Yahushua by name. Of course, in English, we see what we see in our English Bible. You understand? But understand that this particular Yahushua was called the Anointed One. And we see it written here. You understand, my brothers and sisters? Thank you, Farmer King. So far we see John the Baptist, an historical figure, Yahushua. We see James, the brother of the master, an historical figure, Yaakov. Now we're going to see what Josephus said about, as far as Master Yahushua is concerned. So, now he already talked about Master Yahushua already. And a lot of scholars, they don't really have an issue with this because, you know, there's no denying that we know that Master Yahushua existed. So even all you haters out there, you know, the ones of you who are going to continue to go against my master, you may not like it, but you can't negate the history. You understand? You can talk about it. You can suck your teeth. You can do whatever you're going to do, but you can't. For the real, those of us who are in the real body of Messiah, we see you. It is what it is, but you can't erase what's here. It's here in the earth. You can't erase it. You understand? Now, the problem that scholars have with this particular section, those of you go to Antiquity of the Jews. Thank you so much for Farmer King for who you are. Go to the Antiquity of the Jews, book 18. Chapter 3, section 3. And also for those of you who may know it by this, I'll be reading from Antiquities 18 and 63. And this is a very controversial, and it's been in debates, but this is another historical record of what Josephus says about Master Yahushua. I'm going to read it to you. And look what it says. Thank you so much, Farmer King, for who you are. It says, now there was about this time, and it has Jesus, but those of us, we know it's Yahushua. But he says, now there was about this time, Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, thank you for making correction. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. You see that? Now, this is very controversial in the scholastic world. Do you understand, my family? What I just read to you right here is very controversial. You have scholars that have different opinions about this. Now, Father King is given permission to really analyze this. So we are not ignorant. You understand, my family? When somebody come up to you and say, Master Yahushua of Nazareth never existed, then now you able to not sit there and go back and forth and waste your precious breath that I found he gave you. You just speak you don't have to rehearse. You can just speak what he give you to speak. You understand? And if they truly his, they're going to come out of that. If they not, they're going to stay in darkness. You understand, my family? So understand this here, that this is very controversial. Now, I'm going to be reading out of, this is a translation of Eusebius, church history. And I'm going to read something interesting because now, as our Father King lead, we're going to really look at something pertaining to this controversial quotation. Because you have some scholars, what they'll say is that Josephus wrote some of it, but then there's some things that were interpolated by, Christians. This is what they'll say. You understand, my family? So I want to read something to you, and it's pertaining to this citation, what I just read to you. So I'm going to be reading to you from Eusebius, the church history. This is from a gentleman named Paul L. Mayer, and I'm on page 377 in the appendix. And this is what he says. It says, in book 1, section 11 of his church history, Eusebius quotes the famous passage from Josephus's Antiquity 18.63 that mentions Jesus. Again, we know it's Yahushua, but this is what it says here. And for those of you who may have this, you'll be able to read along. So he says here that mentions Jesus, the longest non-Christian reference to him in the literature of the 1st century AD. For comparison's purposes, the passage is again reproduced here with several extraordinary phrases that I have italicized. Now, for those of you who may be reading along in your own translation of Josephus, or for those of you who may be online, I'm gonna again look at the passage that I just read to you, my family. Okay, as I finally can let us do detective work and really look at this thing. Now, what scholars are saying is that there's certain sections. Now, they will not deny that Josephus, our ancestor, wrote about Master Yahushua. This whole section that I just read to you is not interpolated as far as, in their opinion, in totality. What they'll concur is they'll say that he wrote, there were some things that was added later, but in all, he wrote this, okay? But what I want you all to do is this. As you look at the section, this is the places that they're saying that's interpolated according to their surmising and their assertions and their conclusions. They say where, I'm going to read it again. It says about this, now I'm reading from this translation. It says, about this time lived Jesus, a wise man. Again, I'm going to proclaim to you the name Yahushua, the Messiah. But it says here, about this time lived, and it has Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was the achiever of extraordinary deeds, and was a teacher of those who accepted the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. When he was indicted by the principal men among us, and Pilate condemned him to be crucified, those who had come to love him originally did not cease to do so. For he appeared to them on the third day, restored to life, as the prophets of the deity had foretold these and countless other marvelous things about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to this day. Now, what's interesting is that when I was led to read to you all about the Roman historian named Tacitus, even though he wasn't a believer, based on, as far as what's being written, he spoke about a group of people known as Christians or anointed ones. You understand? So now we have Josephus, who has specified that there was a tribe of Christians. You understand, my family? Now, this is first century writing. So, and again, that word Christian means anointed ones. You understand? As far as the plurality of it is concerned. And we know many of the believers were called by, as far as early names, you have Nazarenes and things of that nature. You have those that was followers of the way and things of that nature. Also, Master Yahushua will refer to them as Talmudim. You understand? So, again, that name, that word, as far as anointed ones, the origin of it goes to Syria, not Rome. Do you understand? It began to be carried on to other regions after that. But what I want you to see is now, look at the quote here. Now, what the scholars are saying, based on their studies, they're saying that now, look at the text closely, my friends, my family, my brothers and sisters. Look what it says. It says, if indeed one ought to call him a man. Now, I don't know if you all want to highlight that or make note of that, but that particular portion, they're saying that there is interpolated. So I want you to, let's see what they're saying. Let's hear their argument. You understand? So what they're saying is that when Josephus is saying, if it be lawful to call him a man, they're saying that is interpolated. Okay? Meaning it was added later on. Okay? Now, another part that they say, thank you so much, Father King. Another part that they say is when Josephus says he was the Messiah, they're saying he didn't say that. Where it says he was the Messiah, or in the version by William Winston, it says he was the Christ. They're saying that was, as far as interpolated. In other words, Josephus did not acknowledge Master Yahushua as being the Christ. But isn't it funny? Because in what we just read in Antiquities, book 20, chapter 9, verse section 1, when he talked about James, the brother of, and he identified Yahushua, and he said who was called Christ. See, that's not interpolated. So what does that tell us? That means that now, regardless if Josephus may have accepted or may not have accepted Josephus didn't say in his writings whether he did or not. He didn't say that, but what he did report, as far as what was known, that Master Yahushua was called the Mashiach. You understand? So scholars are not going to really go to Antiquities, Book 20, Chapter 9, Section 1, and debate that. See, they don't mess with that, but they mess with this here based on their conclusions, and they'll say, well, this is interpolated. I want you to understand that. So again, so far we have, if indeed one ought to call him a man, and also he was the Messiah, or he was the Christ. They're saying that that's interpolated. Okay? Now another part that they say is interpolated was, if you scroll down, it says here, he appeared to them on the third day, restored to life. And in the one by William Winston, it says, he appeared to them alive again the third day. So what they're saying is that that's an interpolation. This is what they're saying. And then the last thing they say is where it says, when you go down, it says marvelous things. And in the one by William Winston, when it says wonderful things, as far as the works is concerned, what they're saying is that was added later on. So technically there's only 1, 2, 3, there's only 4 sections that they're saying has been added. So let's just look at their little argument for a little bit. Now, even if a person read this quotation that I just read to you, and if they didn't even, let's say these other sections weren't even there, it still doesn't negate that Master Yahushua was a real individual. You see this? That he was a wise man. Do you understand? And that also, as far as how he won the Jews and the Greeks, it also wouldn't take the fact away that he was condemned by Pilate and that he was crucified. You see that? It wouldn't negate as far as the prophets that foretold those things. And it wouldn't negate that there was a tribe of anointed ones that were named after him and that they're still alive during the day Josephus was living. You see what I'm saying? So even if the devil, let's see if the devil even tried to take this out, and if people read just this, it still wouldn't take away the fact that Master Yahushua existed. You see, my brothers and sisters. But let me read you something, 3 views of what the scholars, how they feel about this. It says here, again, I'm reading from page 377, and this is Eusebius, the Church History, translated by a gentleman named, again, his name is Paul L. Mayer. And this is what it says here. He says, scholars fall into 3 camps regarding this celebrated reference. 1, it is entirely authentic, occurring as it does in the middle of Josephus' description of Pilate's administration and in all the manuscripts of Josephus. You got that? So that's one view. So all scholars don't just agree and say that it's interpolated. Okay? He's giving you the 3 categories of how scholars view this as far as this particular passage and reference of our Master Yahushua, as far as him actually existing. So you have some that agree that it's authentic. You understand? Here's the second group. It is entirely a Christian forgery, since Origen asserted that Josephus never converted. Now that's powerful. Now, based on the conclusion of one of our African ancestors, when he talks about Josephus, he's the only one, because there was many that wrote about Josephus and that actually read what I was reading to you. Now, he's the only one that came to his conclusion about Josephus not actually accepting Master Yahushua as Messiah. You understand? So because of that, scholars, because of that one witness of Origen, one of our African ancestors, what they'll do is they'll say, well, it has to be a forgery. Okay? Now, this is number 3. This is what some groups of scholars concur with. It says it contains Christian interpolations in what was Josephus' authentic report on, and it has Jesus. We know it's Master Yahushua. So did you all hear that? So scholars are in different categories about this particular passage. And this is beautiful that we're learning this. Because for those of you who are attacking the New Testament or making the attempt to do so, your mouth is going to be stopped. You see this? In the long run, it will. I'm not going to stop your mouth. Our Heavenly Father, His Son, through the precious Spirit, is going to stop your mouth. Now, so I've given you, based on what this gentleman has spoken, as far as those opinions. And on page 378, he continues. He says here, the first option would seem hopeless. No Jew could have claimed Jesus as the Messiah who rose from the dead without having converted and has to Christianity. We know that's talking about the true anointed faith, not the pagan Christian people out here associated with. So notice what he says. He says the second is hardly tenable since the passage occurs in all Greek manuscripts of Josephus and the undisputed reference in Jesus in 2200. So I think that's powerful because for the scholars out there, they all concur that the Greek manuscripts, now some of you might have a problem with the Greek manuscripts of Josephus. Was he a man that knew the Hebrew language and also the Aramaic language? Yes, he did. He wrote it. Now, are there any extent in the language? No, but guess what he did? There's something he did pertaining to the Greek. So what scholars cannot deny is that the passage, it's consistently passed in even the ancient Greek manuscripts of Josephus. That's been passed down. You see this? Now, he says here, according, look what he says. He says, well, let me read it again. He says, the second is hardly tenable since the passage occurs in all Greek manuscripts of Josephus and the undisputed references to Jesus or Master Yahushua, but it says he put it Jesus, in 2200 would doubtless have supplied more identifying material if this were the first mention of, and it has he put Jesus here. So what he's saying is based upon the manuscript evidence, you can't really dismiss it. It's basically what he's saying. Then he says this, accordingly, a large majority of scholars today favor the third option, that the passage has been interpolated. So majority of scholars, which is very interesting now. See, just because a person is a scholar doesn't necessarily mean that they truly are a believer. You have some people who go into the scholastic arena and they study it for different opinions. You see this? There's even been reports of people who come in believers and they get too much head knowledge and then all of a sudden they become agnostic or they actually will deny the faith. So just because a person is not a scholar, I mean, that's their particular field. You know, now that does not mean all scholars are not believers. But what I'm led to tell you is that just because a person has that title and they have so much credentials and accolades does not necessarily mean that they really truly are a believer. You understand? But again, in the Greek where it says he's a wise man, that word, that terminology is known as scoffers anir. So what's interesting is that majority of scholars out here, again now, scholars are in different opinions of this passage because this is a very controversial passage. You see this, my family? And notice how I want you to go back in your mind. Remember what I was led to tell you, how because of what Origen had said, because of a certain reference and a certain conclusion, scholars have a certain feeling about that. And I'm going to read it to you, what Origen said about that particular, as far as Josephus, as far as his conclusion of Josephus not believing in Messiah. I'm going to be going back to a dictionary of early Christian beliefs. Now I'm going to be reading from Josephus, as far as the section in the book about Josephus. Thank you so much, Father McKean. And I'm going to read the quote from Origen, because you just heard what I read of how you have some scholars based upon Origen's conclusion. They have come to their conclusion saying, well, Josephus, he really wasn't a believer. He wrote about Master Yahushua, but he didn't really believe or accept him as Messiah. Now, this is the one that this is what Origen wrote in 245 AD. He says, and now he's talking about the James. Now we just read about what happened to James in Josephus. Now listen carefully. He says, this James rose to so great a reputation for righteousness among the people, that Flavius Josephus, who wrote the Antiquity of the Jews in 20 books, when wishing to present the cause why the people suffered such great misfortunes, that even the temple was razed to the ground, said that these things happened to them as a result of God's wrath. This was because of the things they had dared to do against James, the brother of, and it has Jesus. We know it's Yahushua. But this is what it says here. It says, against James, the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ. And the surprising thing is that although he did not accept Jesus as Christ, Josephus still gave testimony that the righteousness of James was so great. Josephus says that the people thought they had suffered these things because of James. This was written by Origen in 245 AD, Eastern Writer, Volume 9, page 424. So scholars, based on what I just read to you, because of what Origen specified back in 245 when he wrote this, and what he said about Josephus not receiving Master Yahushua, it has Jesus here, but we know it's Master Yahushua. I'm going to proclaim that. Understand that. But based on that conclusion, this is why scholars, they would say, well, Josephus he didn't really believe in the Messiah. But Josephus doesn't say that, does he? There's nowhere where Josephus said, he didn't say that I don't believe in the Messiah, in that, Master Yahushua is the Messiah, is not the Messiah. He never said that. But what we know what he did say, based on what Origen just quoted, he acknowledged James, the brother of Master Yahushua. And then he said, in other words, he acknowledged Jacob, the brother of Master Yahushua. And then he said, who was called Christ. You understand? Or Mashiach. So he acknowledged, and scholars cannot refute this and say that that was interpolated. Because what our ancestor Joseph, the son of Matif Yahu, what Yahushua was saying, he was basically saying what was known and what was called about Master Yahushua. So it's cut and dry. He was identified as the Messiah. Now, what they have a problem with is this particular quotation out of book 18, chapter 3, verse 3, or section 3, when it says, he was the Christ. See, they have a problem with that. And what they're saying is that was an interpolation. But they're not going to deal with what Josephus wrote when he said he was called the Christ. You understand? So I just wanted to read you that quote. Now here's another quote from Origen pertaining to Josephus, what he wrote about John the Baptist. I'm going to read it to you. He says, the existence of John the Baptist is related by a man who lived not very long ago after John the Baptist and Jesus, Master Yahushua. He says, in the 18th book of his Antiquity of the Jews, Josephus bears witness to John as having been a Baptist. Now, this writer, although not believing in Jesus as the Christ, Master Yahushua, in seeking after the cause of the fall of Jerusalem, says that these disasters happened to the Jews as a punishment for the death of James the Just, who was a brother of Jesus, or Master Yahushua. And that was written a little later in 248 by Origen. Volume 4, page 416. So, again, there's these two quotations by Origen, the man in Africa, by him specifying his assertion and his conclusion based on Josephus, based on him saying Josephus did not accept Master Yahushua as Messiah. This is why scholars today, and notice, those of you who are true students out there, there's no other early writer that they spoke about Josephus, but they didn't speak or give their final judgment on whether or not he was a believer or not. They didn't talk on that. Origen was the only one who specified that specifically. So because of that, scholars have come to that conclusion and say, well, he wasn't a believer. You understand, my brothers and sisters? I want you to be thoroughly educated so you understand as far as the arguments. Now listen here, and we'll be done with as far as this particular section pertaining to Master Yahushua. But it says here, as far as new scholarship coming, it says here I'm reading back in my Eusebius, that's translated by Mr. Mayer, page 378. He says in 1972, and for those of you who can do your research on this as you're led, it says in 1972, Professor Shlomo Pines of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem announced his discovery of an Arabic manuscript of Josephus written by the 10th century Melkite historian Agapius, in which the passage in question translates as following. Now I'm going to read this quotation, this section one more time, but this is how it's translated in this 10th century manuscript that's in Arabic. Now look what it says here. It says, at this time, there was a wise man called Jesus. That's what it says. Of course, we know it's Yahushua. And now in the Arabic, you all do your due diligence to find out how it's specified there. But it says, at this time, there was a wise man called, it has Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after the crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have reported wonders. And the tribe of Christians so named after him was not disappeared to this day. Now there's a footnote where it talks about the final sentence. It says that he concludes that it was the original text. Now this is interesting. So in this Arabic manuscript that goes to the 10th century, Melkite historian Agapius, what they're saying is that last sentence where it says, and the tribe of Christians so named after him was not disappeared to this day, in that particular manuscript, that's not in there. But what's interesting that the scholar, it says, while the final sentence is not in Agapius, Pines, which is this professor, Pines justifiably concludes that it was in the original Josephian text. You see that? Now the question that we need to all ask ourselves is why is now there's nothing wrong with another witness of the record, but the question is, why are scholars out there coming to a solid conclusion of a 10th century manuscript when we have manuscripts out there that predate this 10th century Arabic manuscript? You see this, my brothers and sisters? Interesting, isn't it? So you have the manuscripts, all the Greek manuscripts of Josephus, those ones that predate this one. And not only that, but also when Eusebius in the 3rd century, he wrote his, he lived during the time of Constantine, but he wrote his works as far as his first books, they were all written in, as far as in intervals. So majority of his books were written before, as far as in like the early 300s. But yet when Eusebius quotes Josephus, he quotes exactly, as far as word for word, that I just read to you, that all of you who have Josephus, when you read this section, Eusebius quoted verbatim. So what scholars will say is that Eusebius was not able to detect these so-called Christian interpolations. This is what they're saying. But yet what they'll do is they'll hold this, not all of them, but some of them will come to their conclusion with this 10th century, as far as this Arabic manuscript, as far as that goes to the 10th century, right? That doesn't have the last portion about the tribe of Christians, correct? But yet the scholar will say and conclude that was in the original Josephine text. So you will acknowledge that, but you won't acknowledge when Josephus says, as it's specified here, that he was the Messiah, in other areas that people have a problem with those 4 sections saying they were interpolated. That's interesting, isn't it? It doesn't cause for everybody to get into these foolish debates about it. But for those of us who are in the body of the Messiah, those of you who are equipped, then you're able to have these type of discussions when I find Akeem lead these things to be spoken on. So I want you to see the give and take and see the inconsistencies when you have certain information that's being put before other information. And we know that what Eusebius had quoted, this was a man from Khazar in Israel. We know that when he quoted, as far as the manuscripts and records that he had of Josephus, that way predates this 10th century manuscript, we see how he quote everything verbatim. So the question to scholars, and just something to think about, and for people who want to, basically disrespect Master Yahushua, if Master Yahushua did not exist, or if these things were interpolated, right? Then where is your proof? Where's your primary sources? We'll speak on your terms. Where's your primary sources, secondary sources that specify any so-called Christian believer that actually, what are their names? What are the dates? What group of these so-called people that came and interpolated? Where's your primary, secondary sources? Where's the proof? What names, what records, what manuscripts do you have of people who say they were anointed ones, bragging and boasting, saying that they interpolated these portions? Where are they? Do you see this, my brothers and sisters? Now, here's something that a lot of people haven't considered. Josephus knew not only the Hebrew, the Aramaic language, he also knew the Greek language. And when people say things about interpolation, see, a lot of scholars, and it's not to diss them or make it seem like, we know more, because there's things that we're not privy to. But our Father King, through their precious spirit, will do what? What will the precious spirit of our Father King do? Lead us and guide us into all truth, remind us of everything that Master Yahushua said. So the spirit of truth is going to find you. So you understand? For you scholars out there, understand. Whether you truly believe or whether you don't, understand. You can have your assertions and conclusions. But understand the spirit of truth, when the spirit of truth is ready, will find you and basically will convict you and lay all things out before us to where we will know what the truth is. So what's interesting is this. Thank you so much, Father King, for who you are. What's interesting is that Josephus says something very interesting that a lot of people really haven't paid attention to. Let's go to, now, mind you now, again, for those of you out there, as I finally can educate you as well as me. Josephus wrote the Wars of the Jews in 75 AD, around 75 to 78. Then he wrote the Antiquities, around 93 to 94 AD. Then he wrote against Appian in 97 AD. And then finally, before he died, he wrote the life of Flavius Josephus, around 99 AD. Okay? So now we're going to go into a later time after he's written Antiquities. And he's going to talk, he's basically writing something, dealing with a gentleman named Appian. So for those of you who have the complete works, turn to Josephus against Appian, and I want to read something to you carefully. So I want you to go, you got to flip past the wars of the Jews, go to where it says, go back, it says Flavius Josephus against Appian, go to book 1. And I want to read you something. And look what Josephus says here. Thank you so much, Father King. He says, look at section 1. He says, listen carefully. He says, I suppose that by my books of the antiquity of the Jews, most excellent Epaphroditus, have made it evident to those who peruse them. Thank you, Father King, for the correction. For those who peruse them, or peruse them. He says that our Jewish nation is of great antiquity and had a distinct substance of its own originality. Originally. Thank you, Father King. As also I have therein declare how we came to inhabit this country wherein we now live. Okay, so now Josephus is explaining about the antiquity. Okay, he already wrote the antiquity. Okay, so now he's giving information. He's speaking to Aphrodite. Now watch what he says here. As far as what he said about it being originally. Now look what he says. He says, those antiquities contain the history of 5,000 years and are taken out of our sacred books, but are translated by me into the Greek tongue. Thank you, my Father, my King. See, a lot of you haven't paid attention to that. You see this? So Josephus bears record. See, people who say, oh, well, you know, it was interpolation, it was things added in. Well, guess what? Now you have negative connotations to interpolation. You do. When someone's trying to alter or corrupt a text. You understand? However, what a lot of you are not realizing is when someone translates something into another language, what are they doing? Many of you who are scholars, and even those of you who are laymen, you will agree and concur that when things are translated from one language to the other, there are certain things that are lost, correct? Also, there are things that have to be added to be, as far as to explain the meaning of what's being conveyed. So what a lot of you don't even realize is that it's what Josephus is basically telling. As far as what he's going against Appian, but basically what he's describing to Ephroditus, he's talking about his antiquities. Now, what we just read about Yahushua, John the Baptist, James, the brother of the Master, and Master Yahushua himself, okay? Where are those things all written at? They're written what? Where? In the antiquities. Isn't that interesting? So now what does that show the whole scholarly world and even scoffers? It shows that they're a part of Hebrew history. You see this? But what's interesting is that Josephus bears record. Now this is my primary source. Now the question is, for those of you who are scoffers out there, where's your primary source of these so-called people that came and interpolated what is in Josephus about Master Yahushua? But Josephus tells you here that he himself translated it. Translated what? He translated the antiquities. Into what language? The Greek tongue. So for a man who spoke the Semitic language, the Hebrew and Aramaic language, to then be able to translate the whole antiquity, as he states, he translated the entire antiquity into another tongue. Josephus would have to do what? He would have to explain, you understand, as far as translating what those Semitic words meant and what they expressed. This is why even in our English Bibles, and even when we have translations of works, translations of manuscripts, there are times where you will see words either in italics, or you will see words that are actually not a literal. You have some, those of you who are translators, you know that there are things that are known as, please guide me, Father King, with your wisdom. For those of you who are translators of the Bible, and even those of you who are students that are able to translate, you already know you have word for word when you're doing a word for word as far as the equivalent of words, and you also have thought for thought where things are actually paraphrased. We see this with our ancestors who translated the Septuagint. We see this also with our ancestors who translated as far as please guide me, Father King, the Aramaic Targums, the Targumims, which are what? Paraphrases of the scriptures. Do you understand? Even Ezra, our ancestor, had to give the sense of the scriptures. You can look in the book of Ezra and see that. You understand? When Ezra had to, you have, of course, Ezra and Nehemiah are connected. But even when they had to actually guide from king, they actually had to, because the people didn't understand, they had to actually give the sense of it. You understand? So even in translation, you have word for word, thought for thought. And as far as the equivalents are concerned, that are going to be conveyed to the best of its ability. But understand what Josephus states. I'm going to read it again. As I'm led by Father McKee. He says, those antiquities contain the history of 5,000 years and are taken out of our sacred books, but are translated by me into the Greek tongue. Now he's going to explain why. Listen what he says. However, since I observed a considerable number of people giving ear to the reproaches that are laid against us by those who bear ill will to us and will not believe what I have written concerning the antiquity of our nation, while they take it for a plain sign that our nation is of a late date, because they are not so much as vouchsafed a bare mention by the most famous by the most famous historiographers, thank you, Father King, among the Grecians. I therefore have thought myself under an obligation to write somewhat briefly about these subjects in order to convict those that reproach us of spite and voluntary falsehood, and to correct the ignorance of others, and withal to instruct all those who are desirous of knowing the truth of what great antiquity we really are. So he was writing it, and he translated it for people who actually spoke evil against him as far as the writings, but also so that way people would actually know the history. Do you see this? But again, understand, Josephus himself, he's letting the world know, as he did during his time, that he was the one that translated it. He did it. You see this, my family? Now, the question we got to think about is this. Out of all these years, isn't it interesting? Why would Abba allow, this is a rhetorical question, why would Abba allow the record of Josephus to remain here? You see this? That's interesting. So, again, when people say that the works of Josephus or certain sections was interpolated, they basically just have they have their conclusions why. So we're not going to say that there's no evidence of their conclusions why they think that way, but there's no evidence of people who are admitting, you understand? Or people who say that they saw this person or that person went and actually interpolated the section about Master Yahushua. But what we do have is a primary source of Josephus himself, specifying that the antiquities that he wrote, that he translated it into the Greek tongue. So Josephus is telling. You see this? Thank you so much, my father, my king. So for those of you, continue to go back as you're led to study yourself, to show yourself approved. If you're going to critique the New Testament, well, you can get in your emotions and feelings about it and have your assertion and your opinion. But if you really honestly are going to really know for a surety that, oh, well, this is true, or whether this is true or false, and I'm telling you it's true, well, then what you need to do is to really take your time, pray, and do your due diligence. You see this? Anybody can come out here and say, this is false or this is false. Anybody can do that. But to be able to actually labor and actually work at it and study and to learn, well, it depends. People are cut from two different cloths. Thank you, my Father King, for your wisdom. So, now, and as our Father King lead, again, he's going to deal with, for those who say that Josephus and Apostle Shaul are the same person. You see this? For those people who come with that erroneous conclusion, haven't even taken the time to really thoroughly study the epistles of Shaul and even study what Josephus wrote about his life. Because when you go and look at the life of Josephus and you actually read that and contrast that, how can these two men be the same? Thank you, my Father, my King. So, again, you have some people who come to the conclusion and say that Josephus did not believe. Well, this is something that you have to take into consideration. Because Josephus did not, he proclaimed that Master Yahushua was called the Messiah. There's no refuting that. You understand? Now, people have their conclusions with, as far as the interpolation, but our Father King just walked us through what Josephus said himself that he was the one that actually translated the Antiquities. In other words, what that means is that he wrote the Antiquities in the language, in the Semitic language, but then he translated it afterwards. And we all know that when you translate from one language to the next, you're going to do what? There's going to be some things, of course, that's going to be, lost in translation, but there's going to have to be things that's going to have to be expounded in order for other people to understand. Do you see this? So notice the history, the primary source, and notice the proof in Josephus' witness that he himself said that he translated it into the Greek tongue versus people who say that their interpolations based on, what Origin has specified, but they have no proof of what particular person did what, had what manuscript, translated what. They have no names, they have no dates, they just have that speculation. But we have what Josephus said, that he was the one that went back in his Antiquities that he wrote, and he translated it into the Greek tongue. Thank you, Father, my King. Now, this is something that we got to really look at. Now, Josephus, so am I saying that, am I saying that Josephus was a believer or he was not a believer? Well, what I'm saying is, those of you need to understand this. If you're led and you read the life of Josephus, then you'll be able to see the certain conclusions that he went to. You understand? But what we need to understand was this. Josephus was in the priestly line. So now, here's something that we have to understand. This is a man that's in the 1st century now. You understand? So now let's go to the, before we go, let's go to, thank you so much, Father King, for this in-depth teaching. Let's go to Acts. And we did go over this, but our Father King is going to remind us again. Go to Acts, the 6th chapter. See, a lot of us, we're not saying that you all are not paying attention, but we have to really go back just to look at some things before we come to certain conclusions. See, some things is just you may not need to speak on. You understand? As far as the lack of proof, the lack of evidence, some things is just, you let it be. But this is interesting. Look at Acts, the 6th chapter, and let's look what our ancestor Lauka wrote to Theophilus pertaining to certain people that believe in Master Yahushua. So again, Acts chapter 6, and look at verse 7. And this is after the appointment of Stephan and the other men who was actually chosen by the apostles to go out and to do the work, because there was issues going on in the between the Hellenist Jews and the Jews of the circumcision. There was odds. The apostles came. They chose 7 men, laid their hands on them, and this is what I want you to see here. So look at verse 7. It says, and the word, again, Acts chapter 6, verse 7. It says, and the word of the Almighty increased, and the number of the disciples multiplied in Jerusalem greatly, and a great company of the priests were obedient to the faith. You see that? Now, I'm not going to sit here and add and say, oh, well, because people say, well, what are you saying? Well, we don't see Josephus' name in there. So it's not even, we're not going to add that. But understand that Josephus was of the priestly line. And what we see is that, again, Josephus wrote in his Antiquities about John, Yehukanan, the immerser, or John the Baptist. He wrote about James. And what's interesting, what a lot of us haven't paid attention to, is Josephus identified James as the brother of the master. So something to think about is, how would he know that he was the brother of the master? What would be his source about that? That's just something to think about. Not to surmise anything, it's just something to think about. He identified him as James, or Jacob, the brother of Yahushua. You understand? Who was called Messiah. You understand? So he talked about in his Antiquities, again, for your edification, John, what we know as John the Baptist, Yehukanan, James, or Jacob, the brother of the master, and Master Yahushua himself. He talked about the 3 of them. You see this? So the question is, how would he have known about that? Just something to think about. But notice here, It says here, it talks about, again, verse 7 again. This is a powerful verse. See, a lot of us, we just read it and we just keep on moving. But look what it says. And the word of the Almighty increased, and the number of the disciples multiplied in Jerusalem greatly, and a great company of the priests were obedient to faith. So what can we learn from this passage? What can we learn from what Yahushua has given to Theophilus regarding the records? What we can learn is that the word of the master, it was increasing. And you had priests, not all, because we know there was the wicked ones, those in authority that was trying to stop the apostles. But what we see is that there was a great number of priests that believed. Now let me show you another thing as I'm led. Go back to go to John. See, if scholars and people out there are going to come to certain conclusions, then you got to be able to also, don't forget about the scriptures. You see this? When you tie things together, go back and then, as you tie everything together, you pray for those of you who are believing scholars and laymen, and you can come to our Father King, go and bring us to a conclusion. So go to John the 12th, or Yuhukanan, the Gospel of John, the 12th chapter. Thank you so much, my Father King, your precious spirit, for who you are. John or Yuhukanan, the 12th chapter, and I'm going to read one verse out of here. And this is pertaining to how there was some that believed in Master Yahushua. I'm going to read one verse here. John 12, look at verse 42. It reads, nevertheless, among the chief rulers also, many believed on him. But because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. Thank you, my Father, my King. So what can we learn by this? Why was I even led to go to Acts chapter 6, verse 7, and then take you, as I'm led, to John chapter 12, verse 42? What is this establishing? It's establishing that you had men of authority, priests, and also chief rulers. You understand? You had in Acts chapter 6, it talked about the priests that believed, they were obedient to faith, a great company of them. And then what we just read here in the gospel, it shows that there were certain Jews, not just any Jews, these were chief rulers. In this particular context, there were many, not some, not a little bit. There were many that believed on him. It says, but because of the Pharisees, they didn't confess him. You see this? And it explains why. Because they'll be put out of the assembly or the synagogue. So that's very interesting to show that there were people of high stature within leadership that did believe in him. You see that? It wasn't just priests, it was chief rulers. Again, not putting Josephus and saying, oh, well, because it doesn't say Josephus' name, but understand when you read the life of Josephus, you'll see what type of man he was. Josephus was a man of, as far as prominence. You understand? So just something to think about. You understand, my family? So that was the main point. It wasn't to just say, to add anything. It's just letting you know that there were people of high stature as far as they had prominence that believed in Master Yahushua. And there were many that they couldn't confess him. Please God and Father King. It's not that they couldn't. They didn't confess him. And it shows why, because they didn't want to be kicked out. Because back then, many of the Pharisees who hated Master Yahushua, if you had anybody that was to confess him, you was going to be put out of the synagogue. You see that? Pull out of the synagogue. Thank you, Father, my King. Now, let's go to... Now again, our Father King, we're almost to the conclusion. So, in this in-depth teaching, what have we learned so far? As far as the authority of the Master through his apostles. Well, we learn about his authority in the Torah. You see this? The apostles, what did they do when they went into the synagogue? Where did they expound from in order to preach Master Yahushua? They went to the scriptures. They went to the law, the prophets. You understand? So We also learn about the prophet like unto Moses. We also learn about if it was Yahushua of Nazareth or Yahushua the son of Nun. And our Father King has really crystallized these things. He's done it in the past before, but he has really crystallized that. So when people who want to, basically try to make Master Yahushua seem like he's insignificant, well, now we've learned that in the Torah, they have a lot of issues that they have to address. And that's on them. You see, our Father King is basically laying these things out so we all can learn. It's not to embarrass anybody, but if people are going to disregard what Abba is doing, and they're going to still say, well, no, this can't be Master Yahushua, well, who else is it that's like Moses? Where is it that Hosea is called Elohim and that he has a prophet? You see this? Where is that? You're not going to find it. So that's a lot that they have to come up with. They're not going to be able to do that. Thank you, my Father, my King, for who you are. See, he's the Almighty, not us. You see this? He's going to deal with his assembly through his Son, through their precious set-apart spirit. You understand? So we learned those beautiful truths, and then we went into history as our Father King guide us to these accusations of Master Yahushua, to it's just ridiculous what's going on as far as these ridiculous assertions of the New Testament, and people who have no regard and they just spit on it and disregard it. Well, we had to go into history as our Father King guide us to really dismantle this foolishness and to reestablish these things. You understand? So now we have to look at this, is the works. For those of you who are struggling with my King, as far as you don't believe in him, or you're struggling, well, Master Yahushua left a window for all of us. Because if we can believe in his works, that's a gateway to where we can believe in him. And he's going to, again, specify this. So let's go to John, the 10th chapter. Yehukanan, the Gospel of John, Yehukanan, the 10th chapter. Thank you so much, Father King. And let's look at verses 37 and 38. This is when he was dealing with those individuals who had a problem with him. And so a lot of people who are struggling, perhaps you can relate, because a lot of these people, they didn't believe in Master Yahushua. They had an issue with him. These ones tried to arrest Master Yahushua. Now look what he says here. Thank you so much, Father King. He says, if I do not the works of my Father, believe me not. But if I do, though you believe not me, believe the works, that you may know and believe that the Father is in me and I in him. Thank you, Master Yahushua. Thank you, Father King. You see that? So this is in love. This is not in hatred. You see, Master Yahushua didn't hate. He didn't hate the people. He was trying to help them out. He desired them to be saved. He desired them to receive him, even though many rejected him. You see this? But notice what Master Yahushua said. Notice what he's talking as far as to his audience for those who are struggling. Notice how look at this. This is powerful. Thank you so much, my master, my Father, my King. Look through your precious spirit. Look what he said. Verse 37 again. He says, if I do not the works of my Father, believe me not. But if I do, though you believe not me, believe the works, that you may know and believe that the Father is in me and I in him. You understand? Let what he said to those who were struggling with believing in him in ancient times, let that resonate with those of you who are struggling today. You understand? Just something to think about, my family, for those who it applies to. Now, let's go to John, the 14th chapter. Now he's gonna be talking to his disciples. And go to John, Yehukanan 14. And for those of you who don't believe in my master right now, but yet you're following along, that's a good thing. I want to commend you for at least wanting to hear. You understand? And walking with me. You understand? For those of you who are haters, well, you continue to do what you do. I don't have no ill will towards you. All I can do is pray for you and move forward. You're not going to stop what our Father King is doing. But for those of you who are struggling and you're here in this in-depth teaching, it shows the please God, Father King, for the right words to tell your people. It shows the as far as how the dedication, how you are truly seeking. You're struggling, but you want things to be right. You want to know them. You love them in the past, but because of things that happen, you was just fed up with it. You understand? But Master Yahushua loved his people. You understand? See, many rejected him in ancient times. You got to understand this. But let's look at this. Thank you so much, Father King. Go again, John 14, my brothers and sisters, and start at verse 8. And he's talking to his disciples. Look what it says here. It says, Philip said unto him, Master, show us the Father, and it suffice us. That's beautiful. See, even our ancestor Philip, he wanted to know the Father. Now, look what Master Yahushua said, verse 9. Yahushua said unto him, have I been so long time with you, and yet have you not known me, Philip? He that hath seen me hath seen the Father. And how say you then, show us the Father? That's powerful. And again, you have people out there who they may look at this verse and interpret it differently. But our Father King, all you have to do is pray. Go back and look at our Father King's beautiful teaching. I am in the Father, and the Father in me. Go back and look at it. You see this? See, it's not my power. All praise to our Father, his precious Son, through their precious Spirit. You see this? So, again, notice that. Notice what our Master said. This is powerful now. Look what he says here. Now this is, oh my goodness, thank you, Father King. Watch what he says. Watch this question. He says, believe you not that I am in the Father, and the Father in me? The words that I speak unto you, I speak not of myself, but the Father that dwell in me, he does the works. Thank you, Father, my King. See that? Master Yahushua always gave honor to Abba Yahuwah. And a lot of people who hate my master, and some people, they struggling, they'll sit there and say, well, he can't be the prophet like unto Moses. He's a false idol, he's this and he's that. Well, but where's your evidence? There's nowhere where Master Yahushua, because a lot of people they'll go into, thank you, Father, my King. They'll go into, you know who you are. You'll go into the Torah, and what you'll try to do is find verses to try to basically condemn my master. But there's nowhere. See, a lot of you make it seem like our master was sitting there with his disciples and he was like, Master, help me, Master. Help me say it the right way. A lot of you make it seem like our master was like, come, let us worship other almighty ones. No. Are you crazy? No, my brothers and sisters. There's nowhere where Master Yahushua was trying to lead the children of Yisrael to worship a false almighty one. Where's that at? My brother said, where's that? It's not there. But look what he said here. Go back to verse 10. Look at how our master is going to give honor to his Father. He says, believe you not that I am in the Father and the Father in me? The words that I speak unto you, I speak not of myself, but the Father that dwells in me, he does the works. Look at what my master is doing. See, you condemning my master. But my master, look what he's doing. So what does that show? That shows that you're misunderstanding. You see this? But see, here's the good thing. Here's the good news. Our master expressed that those things that were spoken against him would be forgiven. But now here's the warning. If you blaspheme against the set-apart spirit, there's no forgiveness for that. Not in this world or in the world to come. See, there's many people that spoke against my master. You see this? Including myself. There was times of ignorance. Well, even me, thank you so much, Adonai, for the testimony, for allowing me to be able to share it with those who are struggling. Even in my time, it was times when I was angry and speaking evil against my master. But you know what my master did? And I thanked him and his father, for being patient with me through their precious set apart spirit, because they could have cut me off a long time ago when it was a dark time. Understand that. But I thank my master for helping me and for helping me to learn of him. And our father drew me to his son. And he'll do the same for you. See, this is not me coming out like I know everything. See, everything that I'm learning, it's not about me, but I just want to say this. Everything that I'm learning, my master, his father, through their precious spirit, they get the credit for that. You understand? Brothers and sisters who are struggling, understand. So notice that there's hope for you, for those of you who are struggling. You see this? So notice how my master spoke well of his father. You see that? Now, look what he says here, verse 11. He says, believe me that I am in the Father and the Father in me, or else believe me for the very work's sake. That's powerful. See, the key, for those of you who are struggling believing in him, you got to believe the works. If you look at the works will guide you. See, the set apart spirit is going to guide us to all truth and remind us of everything the master said. If you look at the works of the Messiah, that's a gateway to be able to believe, to grow and to trust in him. Do you see this? Look what he says here. He says, verily, verily, I say unto you, he that believe on me, the works that I do, shall he do also. And greater works than these shall he do, because I go unto my Father, unto my King. And the works, what are the works? Those early believers that followed the apostles. See, they're built, the church of the Messiah is built upon the foundations of the prophets and the apostles. See, a lot of people, what they'll do is they acknowledge the prophets, but they disrespect and negate the apostles. They disrespect Master Yahushua. You see that? But see, Abba set it up through his precious son. You have the prophets and you have the apostles. You see this? See, people speak evil of the apostles, but you have to understand that authority has been given to them. You understand? And our Father King is going to reveal that before the conclusion of the teaching. So notice that. Notice the works that Master Yahushua was talking about. Thank you so much, Father King, for who you are and for helping your people. Now, let's go to the last verse. Go to John, let's see here. Yahushua, the 20th chapter. And this is to establish the authority of not only our master, but also through his apostles. Now look at the 20th chapter. This is pertaining to the resurrection of Master Yahushua. And when he actually appeared to his disciples. Look what he says here. In verse 19. John chapter 20, verse 19. It says, then the same day at evening, being the first day of the week, when the doors were shut, where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews, came Yahushua and stood in the middle and said unto them, peace be unto you. Look what it says here. He says, and when he had so said, he showed unto them his hands and his side. Then were the disciples glad when they saw the master. So notice that. He's given them tangible proof. You see this? Now look at verse 21. Then said Yahushua to them again, peace be unto you. As my Father hath sent me, even so send I you. And when he had said this, he breathed on them and said unto them, receive you the Holy Ghost, or the set apart spirit. Now look at verse 23 carefully. He says, whosoever sins you remit, they are remitted unto them. And whosoever sins you retain, they are retained. That's powerful. So for people who are, thank you so much, my master, for who you are. For people who are speaking evil against the authority of Master Yahushua and his apostles, understand you need to repent. You understand? And you need to continue to grow, and you need to continue to learn on your personal journey. And so I just thank you, my Father, my King. Thank you, precious set apart spirit, my Father, my King, for teaching your people. I hope all of you continue to grow and continue to learn. And I just think I found a key for this in-depth teaching. And this is something that the brothers and sisters who are struggling can really go and to really, to be able to learn and basically search and study for yourself. And let our Father King guide you. For those of you who are having issues with believing on his son, this is something that, as you're led to, you can pray about this. You should pray about it. And to be able to let our Heavenly Father, to be able to help you. You see this, my family? And so, again, I hope all of you continue to grow, continue to learn, to be able to, in your going out and coming in, to be protected. And, with the precious blood of our Master. And to be able to every day be thankful when your eyes open by the permission of our Father, his precious Son, through their precious Spirit, to just be thankful for another day and to be able to live humbly. You see this? To be humble and to grow and to learn. You understand? To love our Heavenly Father, his Son, their precious Spirit with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. To love your neighbor as yourself. You understand, my brothers and sisters? And to continue to study the scriptures. So anyway, Father, my King, thank you for helping me. And I thank all of you, my brothers and sisters, for those who it applies to, for being with me and enduring and bearing with me and putting up with me. So anyway, love you all. And you all continue to grow in truth. In the name of Abba Yahuwah. In the name of his precious Son, Master Yahushua, the Messiah of Nazareth, through their precious Spirit. Maranatha. Amen.